Good evening and welcome back. Settle in wherever you are, get comfortable, and let tonight carry you somewhere very far from here, both in distance and in time. We are going back roughly 860 years, to a landscape so vast and so raw that the sky there feels closer to the ground than anywhere else on Earth, where the wind never completely stops and the temperature in winter plunge so far below freezing that rivers lock up solid overnight and the breath of horses hangs in pale clouds around their heads, and where the grass, when summer finally arrives, rolls in long waves across distances so great that they can swallow whole armies and make the horizon feel like something that keeps retreating no matter how far you ride toward it. This is the Mongolian steppe, one of the most demanding environments on Earth for human habitation. And it was here, in a world of felt tents and horse herds and blood feuds that stretched back through generations without number, that the Genghis Khan, most consequential conqueror in human history, drew his first breath. His name at birth was Temujin. He would not become Genghis Khan for decades, not for decades of extraordinary struggle, loss, violence, and relentless building. And the story of how a boy born into poverty, abandonment, and captivity transformed himself into a man who built the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen is not merely a story of military genius, though the military genius was genuine and astonishing. It is a story about what happens when an iron will meets the right moment in history. It is a story about how adversity, the particular kind of grinding, existential adversity that strips everything away and leaves a person with nothing but their own mind and will, can forge certain rare individuals into something the world has never quite seen before. It is a story about the collision between ancient nomadic culture, with its ferocious meritocracy and its total commitment to the collective survival of the group, and the great settled civilizations of Asia and the Middle East, which had grown comfortable and in many ways complacent behind their walls and their wealth. And it is, at its emotional core, a story about the breathtaking complexity of a legacy that was simultaneously one of the most destructive and one of the most transformative in all of recorded time. So settle in. This is a long and detailed story, and it deserves to be told properly from the very beginning, from the grass and the cold rivers of northeastern Mongolia, from the felt tent on the banks of the Yonne River, from the moment of a birth that carried, at least in the telling of those who later remembered and recorded it, the unmistakable weight of destiny, the world into which Temujin was born, most likely in the year 1162 by the most widely accepted historical reckoning, though the sources disagree, and some scholars have placed the date as early as 1155 or as late as 1167, was not the unified Mongolia we can find on a modern map. It was a landscape fractured into dozens of competing tribes, each moving across the steppe in seasonal rhythms, following water and grass, tending their horses and sheep and cattle, conducting raids against their neighbors, forging and aching alliances in constantly shifting combinations that made lasting peace nearly impossible and made treachery not a moral failing but a survival strategy. The names of these tribes ring strangely to ears accustomed to the settled world. The Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karids, the Taichiud, the Borjigan. Each tribe spoke in its own dialect, worshipped the sky god Tengri and the earth spirit, Etujin, and a whole constellation of local spirits, organized itself around extended family bonds and clan loyalties that could go back for generations, and measured its wealth primarily in horses. Horses were everything on the steppe. They were transport, they were status, they were military advantage, they were the foundation of nomadic life in a way that is genuinely difficult for those of us raised in settled societies to fully appreciate. A Mongol child learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, sitting in front of adults at first, his small hands gripping the mane, then graduating to his own small horse, then spending years developing the kind of instinctive centaur-like relationship with the animal that allowed a skilled Mongol warrior to shoot an arrow accurately while riding at full gallop, to change direction instantly, to maintain his seat through the kind of rough terrain that would unseat a European knight trained in a completely different equestrian tradition. That combination of horsemanship and archery would eventually make Mongol cavalry the most mobile, most effective, and most terrifying military force the medieval world had ever encountered. With all of that was still decades in the future. In the spring or summer of 1162, when a young woman named Holun gave birth to a boy in a camp near the sacred mountain Berkon-Kauden and the rivers On and Kurlan in what is today the northeastern corner of Mongolia. The birth was unusual, or at least the legend that eventually grew up around it declared it to be unusual. And legends in nomadic cultures carried enormous weight because they were the primary means through which communities understood the selves and the forces that governed their fate. The account preserved in the secret history of the Mongols, a text composed after Genghis Khan's death that remains the closest thing we have to an official Mongol chronicle of his life, tells us that the infant Temujin arrived in the world, clutching a blood clot in his right fist. Among the steppe peoples, this was recognized as a sign, not necessarily a good sign or a bad one in any simple moral sense, but a sign that this child was different, that something in the fabric of the cosmos had already made a mark on him before he had taken his first breath outside the womb. It was a sign that spoke of blood and warfare and the fate of many people yet to be born, and the adults who witnessed that birth and saw what was in the child's fist would have understood on some level that this was not going to be an ordinary life. His father was Yesugei, a chieftain of the Borjigin clan of the Mongol tribe, a man of standing and local influence, though not of the highest rank among steppe leaders. His mother Holon had come to Yasuji's household under circumstances that were violent even by the demanding standards of steppe life. She had been abducted from her previous husband, a man named Chiledu of the Merkit tribe. While she was traveling with him as his new bride, Yesugei saw them, was attracted to Holon's beauty, and with the help of his brothers intercepted the couple and took her by force. Chiluz escaped with his life, but without his wife, Holun, understanding that her circumstances had changed irrevocably, and that her best chance of survival lay in adaptation rather than in futile resistance, became Yesugei's principal wife. The loss of her first husband, the abduction that had defined the start of her new life, stayed with her in ways that would eventually echo through her son's story, in a manner neither of them could have anticipated when he was still an infant. She would prove to be an extraordinary woman, and her influence on her eldest son would be immense. The determination and resourcefulness she would demonstrate in the years ahead, the fierce protectiveness, the refusal to give in to circumstances that would have broken a less formidable person. These qualities did not come from nowhere. Indeed, the child she was raising in that tent on the Ulnon River would absorb them in ways both conscious and unconscious during the years of his formation. Yesugei named his new son after a Tatar warrior he had recently captured, a man called Temujin Ujei. The name itself speaks to the world these people inhabited, a world where enemies became the names of children, where violence and conflict were not aberrant events, but the organizing principle of daily life, where the identity of the clan was built partly from the trophies of conflict with rivals. Temujin grew up in this world and understood it as simply the way things were, learning to ride before he could run well on his own 2 feet, learning to hunt with small bows that matched his size, observing the complex social dynamics of amp life, the way the adults navigated hierarchies and alliances and grudges, and beginning to develop the quality that would eventually define him more than any other: an extraordinary ability to read people, to understand what they wanted and what they feared, and how those two things could be used. The political landscape of the steppe in the 12th century was not simply chaotic, though it could appear that way to outside observers. There were patterns, established hierarchies, alliances that provided relative stability for periods of time, and the Mongol Confederation, while fragmented into competing factions, did have a loose structure within which chieftains like Ye Suji operated. Yesuji was allied with Togrul, a powerful leader of the Karaid tribe who bore the Chinese honorific title Ong Khan and was one of the most influential men in the region. This alliance would prove consequential for Temujin much later, in ways neither could have predicted. But first came the event that shattered everything that Temujin had known in his childhood. The event that set the entire trajectory of his life in a direction that nobody in that camp on the Onon River would have chosen for him. When Temujin was around 9 years old, Yeshugai made the journey to the camp of the Olkanud tribe to arrange his son's betrothal. This was standard practice on the steppe, where marriage alliances were made early to cement relationships between clans, and where leaving a son in a potential father-in-law's household to work and learn was a way of building the relationships that would eventually formalize into something more binding. He found a girl named Bort, daughter of a man called D. Season, and the match was made. Temujin was left at her family's camp, and Yushuge turned for home satisfied with the arrangement. It was on that return journey that everything ended. He stopped to share a meal with a group of Tatars camped nearby, as hospitality on the steppe demanded. The Tatars recognized him as an old enemy. They did not refuse him food. That would have been its own kind of violation of the social code. Instead, they placed poison in what they gave him. He made it back to his own camp, but he was already dying. He sent riders for Temujin, who rode home from the Olkanud camp. But by the time the boy arrived, his father was dead. With Yushuge's death, everything that had protected Temujin and his family from the brutal calculus of steppe survival evaporated in a matter of days. The clan would not follow a child chieftain. They could not afford to. Not in a world where the ability to lead men in battle and to make the difficult decisions that kept a group alive was the only real source of authority. And so they did what groups in that situation had always done with inconvenient obligations. They simply left. The followers of Yeshuge's household packed up and moved away, taking their horses and their felt tents and their winter stores with them. Hulon was left with 5 children to feed in one of the harshest landscapes on Earth. And it was winter, or approaching winter, and there was no clan support, no safety net of any kind. The years that followed that abandonment were, by any measure, brutal. Hulon was a resourceful woman and a fiercely determined one, and she refused to allow her children to simply perish because the world had turned its back on them. She dug for roots along the riverbanks. She found berries that the animals hadn't eaten yet. She organized her children to fish the rivers and to hunt the small animals of the steppe with whatever equipment they had available. The family survived by her will as much as by any abundance of nature, because the nature of the Mongolian steppe in winter offers very little abundance to those without the social support of a functioning clan or tribe. The children learned to work together, learned to share what little they found, learned that survival was a collective enterprise in which everyone contributed or nobody ate. Temujin absorbed lessons from those years that he never forgot. The first was that loyalty was not given freely by the world, that it had to be earned and then maintained through demonstrated worth. The clan had abandoned his family not out of cruelty in any simple sense, but out of self-interest and the cold logic of steppe survival, and he could not blame them for it, even as he remembered it. The second lesson was that the world offered no protection to those without the power to claim it. that powerlessness was the most dangerous condition a person could be in, and that the only solution to powerlessness was the acquisition of power through whatever means were available. These were not comfortable lessons, and they were not the lessons that a comfortable childhood would have taught him. But comfort was not a condition Temujin had access to during those years on the Onon River, and the absence of it made him something that comfortable childhoods rarely produce. There were other episodes in those years that revealed both the violent reality of steppe life and the nature of the character that was forming in the young Temujin. A conflict emerged with his older half-brother Bekta, the son of one of his father's secondary wives. Bekta was beginning to assert dominance over the household in small but significant ways, claiming the best portions of food, exercising an authority over the younger children that Temujin found both intolerable and dangerous to his own position as the eldest son of the principal wife. The conflict came to a head when Temujin and his brother Khazar ambushed Bekta while he was watching the horses on the open steppe and killed him with arrows. Temujin was perhaps 13 years old. His mother Holan was furious with him, and the words she reportedly used in her anger, recorded in the secret history, compared her sons to hunting animals that had turned on their own kind. But Temujin had made a calculation, even at that young age, that the threat Bekta represented to his own leadership of the household was one he could not afford to leave unresolved. He was right, and the fact that he could make that calculation at 13 and then act on it tells you something important about who he was becoming. The episode cemented his position within the family, but it also attracted attention from outside it. The Taichud clan, old rivals who had abandoned Yesugei's family after his death, saw in the growing Temujin a potential future threat and decided to act before he became too formidable to handle easily. They sent men to the camp and captured him in a raid, probably around the year 1177, and rather than simply killing him, which might have invited a vendetta that nobody wanted, they placed him in a kanga, a form of portable wooden stocks hut immobilized the neck and hands, and made the wearer entirely dependent on others for basic functions, and kept him as a slave and prisoner among their various camps as they moved through their seasonal round. It was a calculated humiliation, and it lasted long enough to leave a permanent mark on him. Being in a kangyu, being entirely subject to another person's will, unable to feed yourself or care for yourself, passed from camp to camp as a trophy and a servant, was an experience of powerlessness, so complete and so degrading that most people who survived it were broken by it in some fundamental way. Temujin was not broken. He was, if anything, clarified. The experience of absolute powerlessness confirmed for him, with a visceral immediacy that no amount of theoretical understanding could have provided, exactly what he was working toward and why, and it hardened his resolution in ways that his comfortable contemporaries, the sons of established chieftains who never experienced anything like this, would never fully understand. His escape came through a combination of his own courage and the sympathy, or perhaps the quiet admiration, of a man named Sorkan Shira, one of the Taichud camp followers who was moved by the young prisoner's bearing and who helped conceal him when he managed to get away. The escape itself involved Temujin striking a guard with the kangwei during a festival gathering when attention was elsewhere, and then hiding in the Onon River with only his face above water while searchers moved along the banks around him. Sorkan Shira found him there and chose not to turn him in, letting him hide until the search moved on, and then helping him get away entirely. Temujin did not forget this. He was constitutionally incapable of forgetting a kindness or a betrayal, and Sorkan Shira's choice would eventually be rewarded with a generosity that the man probably did not expect to survive long enough to receive. After the escape, Temujin returned to his family and began the project that would occupy the next several decades of his life, building a following. one person at a time, with a deliberateness and a patience that belied his age and his circumstances. He was not starting from nothing. He had his family. He had his lineage as the son of a Borgigan chieftain, and he had something that is almost impossible to quantify, but absolutely unmistakable when you encounter it in the historical record. A quality of presence, of personal magnetism, of the ability to make people feel that following him was not simply a transaction, but an alignment with something larger and more significant than themselves. People came to his camp in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups. Some were drawn by the reputation of his bloodline. Others came because they had heard specific things about him, about how he treated those who served him loyally, about the fact that he remembered faces and names and services rendered even years after the fact. Others came simply because they had encountered him and found themselves persuaded by something they could not entirely explain. The first real test of his growing power came as tragedy. Bort, the girl from the Okanud tribe to whom he had been betrothed as a child, had finally been retrieved and married, and she was now living as his wife and beginning to establish the household that would become the center of his growing enterprise. Then the Merkits raided his camp. The Merkits had a grievance that went back to Holan's original abduction from one of their kinsmen, and they collected on it now, taking Bort and a handful of others while Temujin and his brothers fled into the hills. The abduction was a devastating blow on multiple levels. It deprived Temujin of his wife, which was obviously personal and painful. But it was also a public humiliation, a demonstration to everyone watching that he was not yet powerful enough to protect his own household, which in the political calculus of the steppe was essentially an advertisement of weakness. He could not let it stand, and he did not have the power yet to avenge it on his own. So he did what he would do throughout his life when the situation demanded it. He built alliances. He reached out to Togrul, the Ong Khan who had been his father's ally, invoking that old relationship and the obligations it created. He reached out to Jamuka, a boy from the Jataran tribe whom he had known as a child and with whom he had once exchanged gifts and pledged the Mongol ceremony of sworn brotherhood. Both responded with forces, and together they found the Merkit camp and destroyed it, recovering Bort and demonstrating to everyone who was paying attention that Temujin was a man worth investing in. The campaign was also the beginning of a divergence. Jamuka was similar to Temujin in many ways. Both were intelligent, both charismatic, both ambitious, beyond what the steppe would normally accommodate, but their fundamental visions for the world they wanted to build were incompatible in ways that would only become fully apparent over time. Jamuka was a man of the old order at his core. He believed in the traditional tribal hierarchies, organized his followers along lines of clan and kinship, and measured status the way the steppe had always measured it, by birth and by bloodline. He was very good at it. He would eventually gather a larger following than Temujin for a period of time, and he would be recognized as a Gur-Khan, a supreme Khan over a confederation of tribes, before Temujin's rise displaced him entirely. Temujin was doing something different, something that the old order had no real framework for understanding or dealing with. He was organizing his followers not by blood, but by loyalty. He was appointing men to positions of command based on what they had demonstrated they could do, not on who their fathers were. He was in essence building a meritocracy in a world that had always been organized around aristocracy and clan hierarchy. This was not a philosophical position in any self-conscious sense. It was a practical strategy that emerged from his circumstances and his observations about what worked and what did not. A man who did not have a noble bloodline and a vast clan network behind him, as Temujin had not had for most of his life, needed other sources of loyalty. What he discovered was the demonstrated ability and proven reliability, combined with the very real rewards that loyal service could bring, created a kind of loyalty that was in some ways more durable than the loyalty of blood, because it was continually renewed by ongoing experience rather than simply assumed on the basis of shared ancestry. The years between the rescue of Bort and the Great Assembly of 1206 were years of constant movement, constant warfare, and constant expansion. The Tatars who had poisoned his father were eventually defeated and largely exterminated, with Temujin ordering that all male Tatars taller than the axle pin on a cartwheel be killed. The children small enough to be raised as Mongols rate are than as enemies spared. The Merkits were broken and scattered repeatedly until they ceased to function as an independent political force. The Kharid tribe under Togrul eventually turned against Temujin when the older man felt his position threatened by his former allies' growing power, and after a period of military reverses that briefly threatened everything Temujin had by LT, he regrouped and defeated the Kharids so thoroughly that Togrul was killed by the Naimans while fleeing, and the Kharid Confederation was permanently dissolved. The Naimans, who occupied the western portion of the Mongolian plateau and were in some ways the most sophisticated of the steppe tribes, having adopted the Uyghur writing system and maintaining a court with literate administrators, require a major campaign to defeat, but were finally broken at the Battle of Chakamart in 1204. Among the prisoners taken when the Naiman power was shattered was a Uyghur scribe named Tatar Tonga, the keeper of the Naiman royal seal. Temujin could have killed him or simply set him aside as irrelevant. Instead, recognizing the value of what the man knew, he put Tatar Tonga to work teaching Temujin's sons to read and write the Uyghur script. That script would become the written language of the Mongol Empire. The decision was characteristic: see the value in what others would discard, absorb useful capabilities wherever they can be found, and always be building towards something larger than the current moment. Jamuka was the last significant rival. Captured eventually after a long series of campaigns and counter-campaigns, he was offered mercy, or at least the opportunity to serve. He declined. By some accounts, he requested execution in the manner befitting a noble warrior of the steppe without the shedding of blood, which in Mongol tradition meant having the spine broken. Temujin granted this in 1206. He had defeated the one person who had known him longest and understood him most clearly. And with Jamuka gone, and with every other significant power on the Mongolian plateau either absorbed into his confederation or destroyed, there was nobody left to oppose him. In the spring of 1206, on the banks of the Onon River near the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun, where Temujin had once hidden in the water to escape his captors, a great assembly was called. Every significant tribal leader on the Mongolian plateau came. A great white standard, made from the tails of stallions, was raised, and the assembly proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan. The meaning of the title is still debated by historians. Universal ruler is the most common translation, though oceanic, vast, fierce, and simply the king of everything have all been proposed by scholars working with the ancient Mongol terminology. What the title meant in practical terms was perfectly clear. After decades of warfare and maneuvering, after a childhood of poverty and a youth of hardship that would have destroyed a lesser person, after building from essentially nothing, he first genuinely unified Mongol state in history. Temujin was 44 years old, and he was now the undisputed master of the Mongolian steppe. The boy who had been left to starve with his mother and siblings after his father's death was now the ruler of a unified people who had never been unified before him. The 1206 Kurultai was not simply a ceremony, though it was that. It was the moment at which Genghis Khan formally began the project of transforming the Mongols from a collection of competing tribes into something the world had no word for yet. He did not rest on what he had accomplished. He immediately began the systematic work of building institutions that would outlast the moment of their creation, that would make the new Mongol state function not just while he was alive and personally directing it, but for generations after. The military reorganization he implemented was perhaps the most immediately consequential of these institutional changes, and it was also the most radical in its implications for Mongol society. He divided his entire fighting force into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. These units were called in Mongolian Arbans, Zuans, Minghan, and Tumen. Each level of organization had its commander, appointed by Genghis Khan himself or by commanders he trusted, and those commanders were responsible for the training, supply, discipline, and performance of their units with a directness that lingers, left no ambiguity about accountability. If a unit failed, the commander answered for it. If a unit excelled, the commander was rewarded and elevated. The system was comprehensible to everyone in it and left very little room for the kind of ambiguity and evasion that plague more complex bureaucratic hierarchies. The truly revolutionary element of this reorganization, the thing that distinguished it from any previous attempt to organize steppe fighting forces, was that the units deliberately mixed men from different tribal backgrounds. An arban of 10 soldiers might contain Mongols, Tatars, Merkids, and former enemies who had submitted and been absorbed into the Confederation, all required to serve together, to protect each other, and to owe their loyalty not to their Ian chief but to their unit commander and ultimately to Genghis Khan. This was a direct assault on the tribal system that had kept the Mongols divided for generations. By making the military unit rather than the tribe the primary social and political unit for men of fighting age, Genghis Khan simultaneously weakened the old tribal loyalties that could produce factions and rebellions and created new loyal ties to the imperial system that were stronger and more reliable because they were based on shared experience and proven mutual dependability rather than on the accident of birth. He also established the Caciquetan, his personal guard of 10,000 elite warriors. The Caciquetan served a function that went well beyond providing physical protection for the great Khan. It was the empire's training academy for future commanders, young men from across the Confederation, including the sons of tribal leaders who had submitted, and the sons of particularly meritorious officers were selected to serve in the Caciquetan. There they received the best military and administrative education the Mongol system could provide, and there they were, under the direct observation of Genghis Khan himself, who could assess their abilities, test their judgment, and identify those who should be elevated to command positions throughout the expanding empire. Those who performed well were promoted. Those who did not were reassigned to less demanding roles. The system produced a generation of commanders who were personally known to the great Khan, personally evaluated by him, and personally loyal to him in a way that transcended the more abstract loyalty owed to a distant ruler by a subject while has never met him. The Yasa, the collection of principles and decrees attributed to Genghis Khan, was the legal and philosophical foundation of the new order he was building, and this is one of the most fascinating and frustrating documents in all of medieval age. Story. Fascinating because of what the surviving fragments tell us about the extraordinary ambition of what Genghis Khan was attempting to create, and frustrating because no complete text has ever been found. The Yasa was written in the Ulga script on scrolls that were kept in secret archives, accessible only to the ruling family and those they specifically authorized to read them. Our knowledge of its contents comes from excerpts and descriptions in sources written by Arabic, Persian, Chinese, and European chroniclers, who saw it applied or heard it described by those who had seen it, and the picture they paint is fragmentary but revealing. What the sources agree on is the Yasa's fundamental orientation. It was designed to serve three primary purposes: to concentrate ultimate authority in Genghis Khan and his successors, to bind the diverse tribal groups of the Mongol Confederation under a single legal framework that replaced customary clan law, and to create a criminal code that applied to all subjects regardless of their social standing. That last element is worth dwelling on, because it was genuinely remarkable for its time and place. In the societies that surrounded the Mongol world, whether the Confucian hierarchy of the Chinese kingdoms, the feudal aristocracies of Europe, or the court cultures of the Persian and Arab worlds, law was in practice applied very differently depending on who you were. Nobles had different legal standing from commoners. Religious elites operated under different rules than lay people. The powerful could expect better outcomes from legal proceedings than the weak, not as a corruption of the system, but as a feature of it. The Yasa, at least in principle, operated differently. Its punishments were stated to apply to all equally, including, theoretically, Genghis Khan himself. There are accounts of Mongol commanders being executed for violations of the Yasa, even when their military value was significant, which suggests the code was applied with some real consistency. The prohibition on theft, adultery, false witness, and betrayal were absolute. The religious tolerance clause, which exempted religious practitioners of all faiths from taxation and granted legal protection to their activities, was extraordinary by any standard. Muslim clerics, Christian priests, Buddhist monks, Jewish rabbis, shamans of the traditional Mongol faith, all were protected under the Yasa. The Egyptian historian al-Makrisi, who had access to significant information about the Mongol legal system, recorded that the Yasa explicitly ordered that all religions were to be respected, and that no preference was to be shown to any of them. In an age when Europe was burning heretics and launching crusades against both Muslims and heretical Christians, this was genuinely unprecedented. The Yasa also regulated commerce in ways that made the trade networks of the Mongol Empire function with remarkable efficiency for their time. The postal relay system, which the Mongols called the Yam or Ortu, was one of the great administrative achievements of the medieval world. Genghis Khan ordered the construction of relay stations spaced approximately 25 miles apart along all major routes through the empire. At each station, horses were kept fresh and ready, and riders carrying official communications could switch horses without stopping, continuing their journey with only the briefest pause. The system eventually grew, under his successors, to encompass more than 1,500 stations and tens of thousands of horses across the full extent of the empire. Messages that would have taken weeks to travel in any other medieval polity could cross thousands of miles in days through the Yam. Marco Polo, traveling the Silk Road more than 50 years after Genghis Khan's death, was still using and marveling at this system, describing the golden passport tablets called Paizi that guaranteed assistance at relay stations through the empire to authorize travelers. The significance of the Yam extended well beyond the military and administrative communications it was designed to facilitate. It made the empire legible to itself in a way that had not previously been possible, enabling Genghis Khan and his successors to receive reports from distant governors and to send orders back in timescales that made genuine centralized governance of an enormous territory possible rather than purely theoretical. And it made the Silk Road, the great network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, safer and more efficient than it had ever been, which had enormous economic and cultural consequences that we will return to later in Tony's story. Genghis Khan also made a decision in the years immediately after 1206 that would have profound long-term consequences for the Mongols themselves, though probably not in the way he fully anticipated. He adopted the Uyghur script as the written language of the Mongol state. The Mongols had no writing tradition of their own before this, relying on oral transmission for their histories, laws, and cultural knowledge. Writing, by contrast, is a technology of administration and record-keeping that makes large-scale governance of diverse populations vastly more tractable. With a written language, laws could be codified and referenced. Census records could be kept. Tax receipts could be issued and verified. Commercial contracts could be recorded in a way that made disputes adjudicable. The adoption of the Uyghur script did not happen overnight, and literacy spread slowly through the Mongol population. But the decision to embrace written administration fundamentally changed what the Mongol state could aspire to be. All of these institutional innovations, the decimal military organization, the meritocratic appointment of commanders, the Yasa legal code, the postal relay system, the adoption of writing, the protected status of religious practitioners, air pieces of a single larger project, the construction of a state that could not only conquer vast territories but actually govern them in a way that made the conquests sustainable. Genghis Khan had watched other steppe powers rise and fall, and he understood, whether intuitively or from deliberate analysis, that the difference between an empire and a raid was the ability to govern what you took. Everything he built in the years after 1206 was oriented toward that capacity for governance. And now, with the institutions in place and the Mongol people unified behind him for the first time in their history, he turned his gaze outward toward the great settled kingdoms that surrounded his new empire. The first target was not the most ambitious, but the most strategically necessary: the Western Xia Kingdom, a state ruled by the Tangut people and occupying territory in what is now the Gansu and Ningxia regions of modern China, lay on the southern flank of the Mongolian plateau. Before Genghis Khan could safely turn east against the more powerful Jin dynasty, he needed to secure his southern flank, and he needed to learn something that his cavalry-focused army did not yet know how to do: take fortified cities. He began campaigning against the Western Xia in 1205 and 1207, raids that tested defenses and gathered intelligence without committing to a full siege. By 1209, he launched a larger campaign, besieging the Shah capital at Yinchuan with a force that attempted to flood the city by diverting the Yellow River, a plan that badly misfired when the dike broke and flooded the Mongol camp instead. The Mongols withdrew and the Xia submitted and paid tribute rather than face another assault. The lesson from this near disaster was not lost on Genghis Khan. Siege warfare required capabilities he did not yet fully possess, and he would spend the next several years acquiring them by capturing and incorporating the Chinese engineers, artillery operators, and siege specialists who would transform his army from a force of extraordinary mobility into a force of extraordinary versatility. The campaign against the Jin dynasty began in earnest in 1211. The Jin, ruled by the Jurchen people, controlled northern China and had for generations treated the Mongol tribes as subordinate peoples, demanding tribute, playing factions against each other to keep the steppe divided and manageable, and occasionally ordering the execution of troublesome Mongol leaders. The Jin Emperor Wanyan Yongji, when informed that the Mongols were mobilizing against him, reportedly responded with an expression of such dismissive contempt that it has echoed through the historical accounts ever since. He compared his empire to the sea and the Mongols to a handful of sand. He would not live to fully appreciate how catastrophically he had misjudged what was coming toward him. The Great Wall of China in the early 13th century was not the continuous stone structure familiar to modern tourists. It was a series of earthen and stone fortifications of varying quality, manned by garrison troops whose commitment to defending it was in many cases less absolute than the Jin court assumed. In 1211, Mongol forces assaulted sections of the wall, using their archery to clear defenders from the parapets while warriors scaled the walls with ladders. The fighting was intense, and the Jin rushed reinforcements to hold the contested sections. But then the Mongols performed a maneuver that would become one of their most powerful tactical signatures: the feigned retreat. A portion of the Mongol force turned and rode away as if panic had overtaken them, and the Jin commanders, seeing what looked like a fleeing enemy and hungry for the kind of decisive pursuit victory that would demonstrate their superiority, ordered their forces out from behind the wall to give chase. the Mongols turned and destroyed them in the open. The defenders who had not pursued found the gates they had been holding suddenly indefensible. The wall opened, and the Mongol army flooded through into the Jin heartland. What followed in the years between 1211 and the eventual fall of the Jin capital in 1215 was a campaign of a scale and thoroughness that fundamentally transformed the character of northern China. Contemporary sources describe the destruction of approximately 90 cities in the years 1212 and 1213 alone, and while the precision of that number should be treated with appropriate historical skepticism, the underlying reality of massive urban destruction is confirmed by multiple independent sources and by the archaeological record. The Mongols did not simply raid these cities and move on. They systematically stripped them of their wealth and their useful human capital, taking craftsmen, engineers, scholars, and administrators who possessed skills that the Mongol system could use, and killing or dispersing those who had no to offer or who had resisted. The population of northern China declined catastrophically over this period, a demographic collapse that the region would not fully recover from for generations. The Jin capital, then called Zhongdu and located near modern Beijing, was besieged and eventually fell in 1215 after the Jin court had already relocated south. The Mongol forces who entered the city found it half abandoned and already burning in some sections, and they completed the destruction themselves. A Khitan Chinese scholar named Yelu Chusai, who served in the Mongol administration and later became one of Genghis Khan's most trusted advisors, described the bones of the dead bleached white in the sun across an area so vast that it required days of travel to cross in every direction. The smell of the ruins, he reported, could be detected from miles away. The scale of destruction was deliberate and purposeful. It served the Mongol strategic objective of demonstrating to every city and every ruler within range of these reports that resistance was not simply futile, but catastrophically expensive, in a way that no amount of negotiation or reasoning could communicate as effectively as the spectacle of a great capital reduced to bones and ashes. The Jin campaign also forced and facilitated the crucial evolution of Mongol siege warfare from a significant weakness into a genuine strength. Before these campaigns, the Mongols had no real capability against fortified cities beyond starving them into submission through prolonged blockade. Their cavalry could dominate any open field engagement anywhere on Earth, but stone walls were stone walls, and arrows could not knock them down. Genghis Khan responded to this problem in his characteristic fashion. He found the people who knew how to solve it and put them to work. Chinese engineers and artillery specialists captured during the early phases of the Jin campaigns were absorbed into the Mongol military organization and given the resources and protection they needed to build and operate siege equipment, catapults, mangonels, trebuchets, and eventually the naphtha bombs and gunpowder-based weapons that Chinese military technology had developed over centuries of warfare, all found their way into the Mongol arsenal. The defenders of the Jin capital reportedly used iron bombs filled with gunpowder, hurled by trebuchets, against the Mongol besiegers. The Mongols noted this and began doing the same. By the time Genghis Khan turned his attention west towards Central Asia, his army included a dedicated Chinese catapult corps, whose operators were professional soldiers rather than conscripted laborers, well-supplied, well-regarded, and trained to solve the specific tactical problems that siege warfare presented. This adaptive incorporation of conquered people's knowledge and expertise was one of the most sophisticated and consistent features of Mongol military and administrative organization, and it was a direct expression of the meritocratic principle that ran through everything Genghis Khan built. Talent mattered above everything else. Origin, religion, ethnicity, prior allegiance, none of these determined what a person could become within the Mongol system. What determined it was demonstrated ability and proven loyalty, two things that could come from anywhere, and that the Mongol system was constitutionally organized to identify and reward wherever it found them. The Jin dynasty was not yet fully defeated when events in the West demanded Genghis Khan's attention, or rather, when events in the West forced themselves on his attention through an insult so massive and so deliberate that ignoring it was not an option he could realistically consider. The Khwarazmian Empire, ruled by Shah Ala-ad-Din Muhammad II, dominated an enormous region of Central Asia, including most of modern Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. It was wealthy, culturally sophisticated, and home to some of the most intellectually and commercially vibrant cities in the medieval world. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Nishapur, Gorganjes, these were not provincial towns on the margins of civilization. They were among the great cities of the era, centers of Islamic scholarship, science and commerce. Their bazaars connected to trade networks that ran from the Mediterranean to the South China Sea. Their libraries containing manuscripts represented centuries of accumulated human knowledge. Genghis Khan had no particular quarrel with the Khwarazmians when he first established diplomatic contact with them. He was fully occupied with the Jin campaign and had no strategic reason to add another major enemy to his problems. He sent the Shah a message through his envoys that has been preserved in multiple Persian and Arabic sources, a statement of unusual directness that amounted to a proposal of peaceful coexistence and trade. He identified himself as the master of the lands of the rising sun and addressed Muhammad as the ruler of the lands of the setting sun, and proposed a firm treaty of friendship and peace along with a commercial relationship that would be mutually beneficial. The Mongol elite had significant personal financial investments in the trade networks that connected Mongolia to the Islamic world, and a stable commercial relationship with the Khwarazmians would have served those interests directly. There is good historical evidence that when Genghis Khan subsequently dispatched a large trading caravan to Khwarazmian territory in the winter of 1218 to 1218, it represented not just an official diplomatic initiative, but a commercial event, in which many members of the Mongol leadership had personal stakes. The caravan consisted of roughly 450 merchants accompanied by diplomatic representatives and a large quantity of luxury goods, including gold, silver, and sable furs. It arrived at the Khwarazmian border city of Otrar, a prosperous trading center on the Siridaria River in what is today southern Kazakhstan. The governor of Otrar was a man named Inalchuk, related to the Shah's mother, and therefore politically protected from accountability in ways that would prove catastrophic for his empire. Inalchuk had the entire caravan arrested on charges of espionage, confiscated all their goods, and had the merchants executed. Whether his accusation of espionage was based on genuine suspicion, political calculation, or simple greed is something historians have debated for centuries without reaching consensus. What is not debated is what he did and what it meant. When Genghis Khan received the news, he responded with the restraint appropriate to a leader who wanted to give diplomacy a final chance before committing to war. He sent 3 ambassadors to Shah Muhammad, 2 Mongols and a Muslim, to demand justice and the handover of Inalchuk for punishment. The Shah's response destroyed any remaining possibility of a peaceful resolution. He had the Muslim ambassador executed and the 2 Mongol ambassadors' beards shaved off, a humiliation specifically calculated to be as insulting as possible within the cultural norms of the time. In Mongol law and culture, ambassadors were sacred and inviolable. Their murder was not merely an affront to the individuals killed, or to the man who had sent them. It was, in the most precise legal sense available in the Mongol legal framework, a declaration of war by someone who had voluntarily placed himself outside the protections that international norms afforded. And it was a declaration of war against someone who happened to have built the most effective military organization in the world. Genghis Khan's response was methodical and unhurried. He understood that war with the Khwarazmians was now inevitable, and he intended to win it as completely and as efficiently as possible. He left his able general Mukhali with a force sufficient to continue pressure on the Jin, paused the eastern campaign, and turned his full organizational attention westward. He spent months gathering intelligence through his extensive network of spies and contacts along the Silk Road, learning everything that could be learned about Khwarazmian defenses, the layout of their cities, the character of their military commanders, the relationships between the Shah and his generals, which were apparently poor, and the geography of the routes his army would need to travel. By the time he actually moved, he knew his enemy with a thoroughness that the enemy almost certainly did not match. The force he assembled estimates range from 90,000 to 200,000 men, with modern historians generally favoring the lower figures as more consistent with what we know about the logistics of the period. The campaign that opened in 1219 was one of the most systematically devastating military operations in all of recorded history. Genghis Khan divided his forces into multiple columns that would attack from different directions simultaneously, creating an operational situation where no single Khwarazmian defense could address the full scope of the threat it faced. Shah Muhammad had made the fatal strategic decision to disperse his forces as garrisons throughout his major cities rather than keeping them concentrated for field battle, a decision that made individual cities more defensible in isolation, but made it impossible to concentrate enough force anywhere to stop the Mongol advance. He found that he could not reinforce any city before the Mongols were through it and moving on to the next one, the city of Otrar, where the incident that triggered the war had occurred, was besieged by forces under Chagatai and Ogedei, two of Genghis Khan's sons. Its garrison resisted with a determination that reflected their awareness of what they had caused, holding out for 5 months before a traitor within the walls opened a gate and the Mongols were able to storm the city. The governor Analchuk himself held out in the citadel until the very end, reportedly throwing roof tiles from the walls at the attackers in the final desperate hours. When he was finally captured, Mongol legend holds that he was executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a poetic mirroring of the greed that had started the whole catastrophe. Modern historians treat this account with appropriate skepticism, since the Mongols did not typically engage in theatrical executions of this kind. But the story reveals something true about the fury that the original incident had generated. Bukhara, one of the most celebrated cities in the Islamic world, was the next major city to confront Genghis Khan directly. He approached it at the head of his main force, which had crossed the apparently impossible Kizilkan Desert, appearing before the city from a direction its defenders had not anticipated. The garrison attempted a breakout that was destroyed in open combat, and the city's remaining population and officials surrendered. Genghis Khan rode into the city to the Great Mosque, dismounted in the courtyard, and delivered a speech to the assembled population in which he reportedly identified himself as the punishment of God sent because of their sins. This was religious theater of a sophisticated kind. By framing his arrival in divine terms, he was both explaining to the population why resistance had been futile and warning them that further resistance would be equally fruitless. The city was systematically stripped of its wealth, but mostly spared from the kind of total destruction that awaited cities that offered more sustained resistance. Samarkand, the Khwarazmian capital and perhaps the most magnificent city in Central Asia, was next. Population estimates for the city range widely, but it was unquestionably one of the great urban centers of the medieval world. Its walls were formidable. Its garrison was enormous by any reasonable reckoning. The Mongols besieged it with their full siege apparatus, their Chinese catapult corps, working methodically against the defenses, while cavalry cut off any possibility of escape or reinforcement. On the third day of the siege, the garrison launched a major counterattack, sortying from the gates in force. Genghis Khan performed the feigned retreat with his cavalry, drawing the defenders out from behind their walls into open ground, and then destroyed them. Shah Muhammad attempted to relieve the city twice, sending cavalry forces that were driven back each time. By the fifth day, the will of the garrison had broken, and all but a die-hard core of the Shah's most committed soldiers surrendered. A small remnant held the citadel for perhaps a month before that too fell. Genghis Khan then executed the soldiers who had taken arms against him, having promised clemency, and then set it aside, a pattern that the sources suggest was more common in the Khwarazmian campaign than in earlier ones, possibly because this scale of resistance had produced a corresponding escalation in Mongol fury. The craftsmen, scholars, and administrators who could serve the Mongol system were identified and assigned to service throughout the empire. The city survived as a going concern under Mongol administration, though much reduced from its former magnificence. Shah Muhammad fled. Genghis Khan responded by sending his two greatest generals, Subutai and Jebe, in pursuit with a force of 20,000 cavalry. What followed was one of the most extraordinary pursuits in military history. Subutai and Jebe chased Muhammad across Iran, through Azerbaijan, through the Caucasus Mountains, circumnavigating the Caspian Sea in a campaign that covered thousands of miles and served simultaneously as a pursuit and as the most far-ranging military reconnaissance in the medieval world. They defeated every army sent against them. They swept through Georgia, defeating the Georgian army, and then turned north into the Pontic steppe, where they encountered and shattered a combined force of Kipchak nomads and Rus princes at the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. This was the first engagement between Mongol forces and the peoples of Eastern Europe, and it foreshadowed with near-perfect clarity what would happen roughly 14 years later when the Mongols returned in force under Batu Khan and Subut. Then, their reconnaissance complete and their intelligence gathered, Subutai and Jebe rode back east to rejoin the main army. Muhammad himself died in 1220 or early 1221, reportedly on a small island in the Caspian Sea. A man who had recently been among the most powerful rulers in the world, reduced to a fugitive with a handful of companions, his empire gone, his cities burning, his armies shattered. He died of illness, probably pleurisy, before the Mongols could catch him, which may have been a mercy, though a small one, given what had happened to the civilization he had ruled. The destruction of Khorasan, the heartland of eastern Persia, was carried out by Genghis Khan's youngest son, Tolui, with a thoroughness that the historian J.A. Boyle described as something from which the region never recovered. Merv, which had been one of the largest cities in the world in the 12th century, with a population perhaps in the hundreds of thousands, was destroyed so completely that it never regained its former significance. The medieval chroniclers who wrote about the destruction of Merv gave figures of dead in the millions, and while modern historians rightly apply heavy skepticism to specific numbers from medieval sources, since accurate census-taking in the sea conditions was impossible and the tendency to exaggerate catastrophe is human and universal, the underlying demographic reality was catastrophic. The sophisticated irrigation networks of the region, which had been built and maintained over centuries and which were the foundation of Persian agriculture's productivity, were destroyed in the Mongol passage and not rebuilt because the organized labor forces that had maintained them no longer existed. The land that had sustained millions of people reverted to desert in large sections and would not recover for generations. Nishapur's destruction was personal in a way that went beyond strategic calculation. Tokok, Genghis Khan's own son-in-law, had been killed by an arrow fired from the city's walls during an earlier engagement. When Tolui arrived with the main Mongol force in April of 1221, the city put up fierce resistance with tens of thousands of archers stationed at its gates before the walls were finally breached. The reckoning was total, the Persian chronicler Juvayni writing within living memory of the events, describes the skulls of the dead being arranged in separate pyramids for men, women, and children outside the city's ruins. Modern historians approach such specific accounts with appropriate caution, since medieval chroniclers working from second-hand testimony could embellish spectacle, but the underlying reality of near-total destruction is corroborated by multi-epoch independent sources and by the city's subsequent demographic collapse. Genghis Khan's daughter, Tokhsha's widow, is said to have overseen the punishment personally, a detail that, if accurate, would suggest the massacre was framed not just as military necessity, but as a form of grief made into official policy. Tokhsha, Herat, by contrast, surrendered peacefully when Tului arrived and was initially spared, though it was later destroyed when it rebelled against Mongol authority after the army moved on. The lesson the Mongols were delivering was expressed through these repeated, systematic demonstrations of what happened to those who resisted, or who submitted and then changed their minds. The lesson was stark and it was effective. The only variable that determined whether you survived the Mongol arrival was the decision you made when they appeared at your gates. Submit immediately and you would be incorporated, losing your political independence but keeping your life and your livelihood. Resist and face destruction so complete that your ruins became a warning for the next city down the road. The Khwarazmian campaign essentially concluded with the destruction of Muhammad's son Jalal-ad-Din's final army at the Indus River in 1221. Jalal ad-Din had been a more capable commander than his father, had gathered a new force and briefly inflicted a genuine battlefield defeat on a Mongol detachment at the Battle of Parwan in Afghanistan, shattering the aura of Mongol invincibility and sparking rebellions across the newly conquered territories. Genghis Khan responded personally, gathering his main army and driving Jalal ad-Din south. At the Indus, the Mongols surrounded him. Jalal-ad-Din escaped by riding his horse off a cliff into the river and swimming across, an act of desperate courage that Genghis Khan reportedly pointed out to his sons as an example of what was possible for a man who had no alternative. Jalal-ad-Din would spend years afterward as a fugitive, fighting and fleeing through Persia and Anatolia until he was eventually killed in 1231, years after the man who had destroyed his empire was himself dead. The organization of Mongol society after 1206 extended well beyond the military into every aspect of daily life on the steppe, and Genghis Khan approached these changes with the same systematic thoroughness that he brought to every other problem he solved. One of the most significant and least discussed of these changes was his treatment of the population of conquered peoples and of the tribal groups that submitted to him. He did not simply incorporate them as a subordinate underclass, as many conquerors before and after him did. He broke up the tribal identities of the groups he absorbed and distributed their members through his decimal military organization, intermingling former enemies with each other and with loyal Mongols until the tribal identity that had previously been the primary source of a man's loyalty and social identity was replaced by the identity of his military unit and his place within the Mongol imperial structure. This was governance of a genuinely sophisticated kind, because the most dangerous thing a conqueror can do is leave the social structures of conquered peoples intact. Those structures provide the organizational framework for future resistance. By breaking them up and replacing them with his own organizational forms, Genghis Khan simultaneously destroyed the infrastructure of potential rebellion and created new bonds of loyalty that ran through the imperial system rather than entered. The women of the Mongol world occupied a position that was different from, and in some respects more powerful than, that of women in the surrounding settled civilizations. Mongol women could not hold military command, but within the household and the camp, their authority was substantial and recognized. Holun, Genghis Khan's mother, remained an influential figure well into his rise to power, consulted on important decisions and maintaining her own household and retainers as befitted her status. Borte, his principal wife, was a figure of genuine political significance throughout his life. When he was away on campaigns, which was most of his adult life, the management of the household, the supervision of the estates, the handling of the complex administrative relationships between the camp and the absent Khan fell to the womb. The tent was their domain in the most serious sense, and within that domain their word was final. This was not equality in any modern sense, but it was a recognition of functional authority that many medieval systems did not provide. The practice of religious tolerance that the Yasa enshrined was not merely a cynical political calculation, though it served political purposes well. The Mongols had their own religious tradition, centered on Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and on the earth spirit, and on the shamans who mediated between the human world and the spirit world. Genghis Khan was personally religious in a traditional Mongol sense, returning repeatedly throughout his life to pray at Burkhan Khaldun, the sacred mountain of his birth region, and attributing his successes explicitly to the favor of Tengri. He took omens seriously, consulted shamans, and organized significant ritual events around traditional Mongol religious practice. But he also watched with pragmatic interest the various religious traditions his expanding empire encountered, and he found in each of them elements he could respect or use. The Nestorian Christians who were present throughout Central Asia, some of them in his own family, through his daughter-in-law Sorgaktani Beki, the Keraite princess who married his son Tului and would later become one of the most powerful women in the empire, provided administrative talent. The Buddhist monks of the Shishiyak kingdom had demonstrated organizational capabilities. The Muslim scholars and administrators of the Islamic world had clerical skills the Mongol bureaucracy needed. The Taoist masters of China, one of whom, Chu Chu, made the extraordinary journey to meet Genghis Khan in Central Asia in 1222, provided a kind of spiritual counsel that the aging conqueror seems to have genuinely valued, with Chu Reporte, Lai advising moderation and an end to killing, and Genghis Khan reportedly listening with apparent seriousness, if not complete compliance, by exempting religious practitioners of all faiths from taxation and requiring that their activities be protected throughout the empire. Genghis Khan secured the goodwill and the administrative cooperation of the people who ran schools, kept records, and mediated between governing powers and governed populations in every society he conquered. It was, in its way, a masterstroke of practical governance, dressed up in the language of principle. And whether it was primarily the former or the latter is probably a question that does not have a clean answer. The logistics that made the Mongol military machine function at the level it did deserve more attention than they typically receive in accounts focus primarily on the tactical brilliance of Mongol commanders. The Mongol army traveled with a self-sufficiency that no contemporary military could match, because the core of that army, the mounted archer, carried his primary food supply with him in the form of his horses. A Mongol warrior traveled with multiple horses, typically 3 to 5, and rotated between them to keep them fresh over long distances. When meat was needed, horses could be slaughtered, or the warriors could open a vein in a living horse's neck, drink the blood, seal the wound, and continue riding. They carried dried meat and dried dairy products in their saddlebags. Food that was lightweight, calorie-dense, and required no preparation. They did not need supply trains of the kind that European armies of the period required, did not need to live off the land in a way that slowed movement, and did not need to maintain base camps and depots in the manner of settled armies. This combination of logistical self-sufficiency and extreme mobility meant that a Mongol army could cover distances in times that seemed simply impossible to opponents who were calculating based on the movement rates of their own armies. The distances covered in the Subutai and Jebe pursuit of Shah Muhammad thousands of miles in a matter of months, were not outliers or exaggerations. They were the Mongol military machine operating as designed. The intelligence system that Genghis Khan built was another element of his military organization that operated at a level of sophistication far beyond what his contemporaries could match. Before any major campaign, the Mongols gathered detailed information about the target through multiple channels. Merchants who traveled the trade routes between Mongolia and the target region were interviewed and sometimes employed as agents. Captured soldiers and travelers were carefully questioned, not through crude torture, though that was available, but through the systematic, patient extraction of information by people who knew what questions to ask. The Mongol diplomatic missions that preceded major campaigns were intelligence-gathering operations as much as they were genuine diplomatic contacts, and the men who served as envoys were chosen partly for their ability to observe and remember what they saw. The result was that when Mongol forces arrived before a city they intended to take, their commanders typically knew the layout of the city, the size and quality of its garrison, the character of its governor, the location of its water supply, the state of its food stores, and the specific loyalties and grievances of various factions within its population. This intelligent advantage was not absolute. There were Mongol campaigns that ran into unexpected difficulties, but it was consistent enough to be a systematic feature of Mongol military success rather than an occasional accident. The psychological warfare component of the Mongol approach was equally systematic and equally sophisticated. The offer extended to every city and kingdom the Mongols approached was always the same in its fundamental structure. Submit now and be incorporated with relatively lenient terms, or resist and face total destruction that will be so complete and so spectacular that the next city down the road will not need to be told what happened to you. The consistency of this offer was itself a weapon, because its credibility depended on Mongols actually following through on both halves of it, both the mercy for those who submitted and the annihilation for those who resisted, and they did follow through, consistently enough that the reputation preceded the army and did more strategic work than the army itself sometimes needed to. Cities that might have organized effective defenses chose instead to surrender without fighting because the alternative was too clearly unacceptable, and cities that did choose to resist were made into examples sufficiently memorable. The T policy remained effective across decades and thousands of miles. The strategic genius of the system was that it minimized the actual fighting the Mongols needed to do, since the most effective battle is always the one you don't have to fight, because your opponent has already decided not to contest the field. The relationships between the Mongol successor states and their subject populations evolved in fascinating and diverse ways over the generations following Genghis Khan's death, and the diversity of those evolutions reflects one of the most interesting features of the Mongol imperial system: its fundamental adaptability. The Mongols had built an empire partly by being better than anyone else at incorporating the useful features of every civilization they encountered, and their successors continued this practice, sometimes to the point where the Mongols themselves became difficult to distinguish from the people they had conquered. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty in China represents this process taken to its most extreme conclusion. Kublai was, in his personal tastes and many of his governing decisions, as much a Chinese emperor as a Mongol Khan. He commissioned Chinese scholars to develop a new script for the Mongolian language, the Pax script, a project that reflected his genuine commitment to Mongolian cultural preservation, even as he presided over a deeply Sinicized imperial court. He patronized Chinese arts and literature. He adopted Chinese ceremonial forms for state occasions. He built his capital, Khanbalik, on the model of a great Chinese imperial city, with walls and gates and a formal layout that followed Chinese cosmological principles. At the same time, he maintained the Mongol military organization and the Mongol identity of his ruling class, prohibiting intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese, maintaining separate legal standards for Mongols and Chinese subjects, and preserving the imperial hunting grounds north of the city, where the Mongol way of life could continue to be practiced in a form recognizable to his ancestors. The tension between these two identities, Mongol conqueror and Chinese emperor, was never fully resolved in the Yuan dynasty, and it contributed to the dynasty's eventual fall. The Mongol ruling class remained a foreign presence in the country they governed, never fully trusted by the Han Chinese majority population, and their insistence on maintaining certain Mongol cultural practices and privileges created resentments that accumulated over the generations until the combination of natural disasters, popular rebellions, and the Black Death created the conditions for the Ming Rebellion that expelled the Mongols from China in 1368. But in the century of their rule, the Yuan dynasty had created the administrative infrastructure of a unified China that the Ming would inherit and extend, and the cultural exchange that the Mongol-era openness to the outside world had facilitated had lasting effects on Chinese science, technology, and artistic tradition that persisted long after the Mongols themselves were gone. The Ilkhanate of Persia followed a different trajectory, one that shows the full range of possibilities that the Mongol system contained. Hulagu Khan, who had destroyed Baghdad in 1258 and ended the Abbasid Caliphate, had a wife who was a Nestorian Christian and maintained close relations with Christian rulers in Armenia and Georgia. For a period, the Ilkhanate appeared to be moving toward Christianity, which generated enormous excitement among European rulers who saw the possibility of a Mongol-Christian alliance against the Muslims who controlled the Holy Land. That alliance never materialized, and the Ilkhanate instead converted to Islam under Hulagu's grandson, Kazan, in 1295, becoming in the process the kind of Islamic state that it had destroyed 37 years earlier. Ghazan was a genuine Muslim convert by most accounts, not merely a political one, and he patronized Islamic scholarship and art with real enthusiasm, contributing to the remarkable cultural flowering of the Ilkhanate period in Persian literature and painting that produced some of the masterpieces of medieval Islamic art. The fact that this cultural flowering happened under rulers whose grandfather had destroyed the cultural capital of the Islamic world in 1258 is one of history's more striking paradoxes. The Golden Horde, which controlled the Pontic and Caspian steppes and exercised suzerainty over the Russian principalities, became over time a Turkic and Muslim power rather than a Mongol one, as the relatively small Mongol ruling class was absorbed into the much larger Kipchak-Turkic population of the steppe it controlled. The Mongol legal and administrative forms persisted, as did the organizational principle of the decimal military hierarchy. But the language of governance became Turkic, the religion became Sunni Islam, and the cultural identity of the Golden Horde shifted away from its Mongolian origins towards something new and distinct. The Russian princes who paid tribute to the Golden Horde and traveled to its capital at Sarai to receive their patents of authority did so for more than 2 centuries, until the Horde's own fragmentation in the 15th century allowed the Russian principalities, particularly Moscow under Ivan III, to throw off the tribute relationship and begin their own expansion eastward into the steppe. The legacy of the Golden Horde period in Russian history is contested and significant. Russian historians of the 19th and 20th centuries debated vigorously whether the Mongol yoke had fundamentally diverted Russia from a European developmental path, leaving it with a political culture more autocratic and less given to participatory governance than its Western neighbors, or whether the Mongol period was simply one external influence among many, and that Russia's distinctive characteristics had other causes. The debate has not been resolved, partly because the counterfactual question at its heart, what would Russia have looked like if the Mongols had not invaded, is inherently unanswerable. What is clear is that the Mongol period created a 2-century interruption in the organic development of the Russian principalities accelerated the importance of Moscow over other Russian cities because of the particular way Moscow's prince chose to collaborate with the Golden Horde and left administrative and vocabulary traces in Russian governance that can still be identified by linguists and historians. The Chagatai Khanate, which occupied the territories of the old Khwarazmian heartland in Central Asia, was in some ways the most turbulent and politically unstable of the four successor states, torn between the settled populations of its Agen, Choral zones and the nomadic traditions of its Mongol and Turkic ruling classes. It fragmented earlier than the other khanates, and its legacy is the most diffuse, but one of its most important products is sometimes overlooked in accounts focused on its political history. The Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the Kyrgyz, and several other Central Asian peoples whose identities and cultures are recognizable in the modern world trace significant elements of their political and cultural formation to the Chagatai period and its aftermath. And most spectacularly, one of the Chagatai Khanate's later successors, a man named Timur, whom Europeans called Tamerlane, emerged in the 14th century to launch a new wave of conquest that briefly reunited much of the Mongol world and that represented itself explicitly as a continuation and renewal of the Genghis Khan legacy. However much the historical reality of Timur's campaigns resembled the original in some respects and diverged from it in others, the most direct, long-term political legacy of the Mongol period in Asia was arguably the Mongol Empire of India, founded in 1526 by Babur, a descendant of Timur, who was in turn a descendant of Genghis Khan through the Chagatai line. Babur invaded the Indian subcontinent from Afghanistan with a relatively small but highly mobile and technically sophisticated army, defeated the much larger Delhi Sultanate at the First Battle of Panipat, using artillery in a way his opponents had not encountered before, and established the dynasty that would rule most of India for the next 3 centuries. His descendant Akbar would create one of the most genuinely cosmopolitan and administratively sophisticated empires the subcontinent had ever seen, implementing a policy of religious tolerance and meritocratic administration that bore unmistakable resemblances to the principles enshrined in the Yasa, whether as direct inheritance or as parallel development under similar governing pressures, is a question historians continue to debate. The Mongol system's influence on the Ottoman Empire, which itself arose partly in the political space created by the Mongol destruction of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia, was more indirect but still visible in certain administrative practices, in the use of slave soldiers loyal to the ruler personally rather than to any tribal or regional faction, a parallel to the Mongol practice of breaking tribal identities and creating loyalty to the imperial system, and in the imperial system of land grants that rewarded military service with economic privileges in ways that resembled Mongol precedents. The Silk Road, which the Pax Mongolica had made genuinely safe for the first and last time in history, was already showing signs of decline by the mid-14th century as the Mongol Khanates fragmented and the security they had provided dissolved. The Black Death, which swept through the Mongol heartlands in the 1340s before being carried westward along the trade routes to Crimea and then to Europe, accelerated this decline catastrophically, not only by killing the merchants and administrators who ran the trade, but by shattering the population base that had sustained the cities along the routes. By the time the trade network recovered to anything like its Pax Mongolica levels, it was the Portuguese exploration of the sea route around Africa that provided the alternative, and the overland Silk Road never again achieved the centrality in Eurasian commerce that it had held under Mongol protection. The story of how Genghis Khan came to be remembered in the centuries after his death is itself a kind of mirror of the different legacies his empire left in different parts of the world. In China, the Mongol period was eventually re-evaluated by later dynasties in various ways, sometimes as a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign rule, sometimes as evidence of China's historical capacity to absorb and transform foreign conquerors, sometimes in more recent times, as part of the complex multi-ethnic history of the Chinese state that includes Mongol rule as one chapter among many. The Yuan dynasty's administrative legacy, including the unified postal system, certain census and taxation practices, and the territorial configuration of China that the Yuan had defined and the Ming inherited, were integrated into Chinese governance regardless of how the dynasty itself was evaluated politically. In the Islamic world, the memory of the Mongol destruction remained raw for generations in a way that no subsequent revaluation has fully healed. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, the one major Islamic power that successfully defeated a Mongol army in open battle at Ain Jalut in 1260, developed a foundational identity around that victory that made the Mongols permanently the defining enemy in Egyptian historical consciousness. The fact that the Mongol Ilkhanate subsequently converted to Islam and became a patron of Islamic culture did not erase the memory of 1258 from the Islamic world's historical reckoning. That particular wound proved to be deeper than political realignment could cure. In Europe, where the Mongol advance had been experienced at the eastern edges but never in the west, the reaction to the Mongol period went through several phases. The initial shock and terror of the 1241 invasion of Poland and Hungary gave way, after the Mongols retreated, to a complex mixture of continued fear and opportunistic diplomacy. European rulers sent missions to the Mongol court, hoping to find in the Mongols the Christian allies of the Prester John legend, a mythical Eastern Christian king who would help recapture the Holy Land from the rear. The missions of John of Plano Carpini in 1245 and William of Ruppruck in 1253 produced the first detailed European accounts of the Mongol court and the Mongolian homeland, accounts that were circulated widely and that fundamentally expanded European geographical and ethnographic knowledge of the world to the east. Marco Polo's later and more extended account, produced in the 1290s, built on and superseded these earlier works to become the single most influential European text about Asia before the Age of Exploration. The broader cultural impact of the Mongol period on European development has been debated by historians for centuries, and the debate has not reached a consensus. The strongest version of the argument holds that the Mongol facilitation of East-West exchange during the Pax Mongolica was a significant contributing factor in the intellectual revolution of the Renaissance, that the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that reached Europe from the Islamic world during this period, the paper-making technologies from China, the compass and other navigation aids, all contributed to the toolkit that made possible both the intellectual revolution of the 14th and 15th centuries and the geographical revolution of the Age of Exploration that followed. The weaker version holds that these technologies would have reached Europe eventually through any of several alternative routes, and that the Mongol contribution was one of timing rather than substance. The truth is probably somewhere between these positions, and the difficulty of establishing precise causal chains across centuries and civilizations makes definitive resolution unlikely. What can be said with confidence is that the world of 1350, a century after Genghis Khan's death, was genuinely different from the world of 1200, before his rise, in ways that were directly attributable to the Mongol period. The political map of Eurasia had been redrawn. The relative power of the great civilizations had shifted. Trade routes and cultural connections that had not previously existed had been created. Technologies and ideas had moved between civilizations at unprecedented speed. The population of some regions had been catastrophically reduced, while others, untouched by the Mongol advance, had grown to fill spaces left by the dead. The entire complex of civilizations that historians sometimes call the medieval world was in the process of ending and in the process of beginning the transformation into what would become the early modern world. And while the Mongol period was not the only cause of this transformation, It was one of the most powerful single forces driving it. Genghis Khan himself, in the last years of his life, was a figure of enormous wealth and power who had not lost any of the qualities that had made him successful, but who was also showing the physical costs of the life he had lived. The horse fall in the winter of 1226, that reportedly began the decline leading to his death the following year, was not his first serious injury. A man who had been fighting and riding since childhood, who had personally led campaigns across distances and through conditions that would have destroyed less resilient bodies, accumulated damage in ways that the medicine of the era had no real means to address. The shamans who attended him could offer ritual and herbs. They could not repair broken bones that had set badly or internal injuries that had never fully healed. By the time he turned his attention to the final Western Shah campaign, he was a man in his 60s in the body of someone who had lived as hard as it is possible to live, and the end of that final campaign would be the end of him. His last known words, or at least the words attributed to him by the Persian historian Rashid al-Din writing several generations later, were instruction to his sons about the manner of conducting the final assault on the Shia capital and Abul, the governance of the empire after him. He was specific and practical to the end. There was no recorded philosophical reflection, no deathbed wisdom about the meaning of what he had done, just orders, delivered as clearly as he could manage, to the sons who would carry them out. He died as he had lived, concerned primarily with the effective execution of the work that needed to be done. The sons to whom he left the empire were a varied and talented group, each shaped by different aspects of their father and each facing different challenges in the inheritance they received. Jochi, the eldest, whose legitimacy was shadowed by the circumstances of Borte's captivity among the Merkits in the period when he was conceived, had predeceased his father by a few months, and the Golden Horde passed to Jochi's son Batu, Watto. Ho would lead the Great Western Campaign of the 1230s and 1240s. Chagatai, the second son, was the strictest adherent to the Yasa of all the children and became the keeper of the legal tradition his father had established. Though he was also temperamentally unsuited for the kind of flexible political jud that governing a complex empire required. Oday, the third son, was Genghis Khan's designated successor, and his selection over his older brothers reflected not just personal preference, but a judgment about who had the combination of qualities needed to hold the empire together. Rough the inevitable difficulties of the succession period, Tolui, the youngest, was the keeper of the Mongolian homeland, inheriting the original Mongol territories in accordance with tradition, and was also recognized as perhaps the greatest military commander of his generation. The son who most approved, Ali inherited his father's genius for the operational art of war. Augade ruled as Great Khan from 1229 until his death in 1241, and his decade of rule was one of the most consequential in the empire's history. He confirmed and extended his father's administrative innovations, built a permanent capital at Karakorum in the Mongolian homeland, formalized the Yam postal system into the empire-wide network that Marco Polo would later describe, and Lao niched the campaigns that completed the conquest of the Jin dynasty and extended Mongol power into Korea, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the Middle East. His death in December of 1241, with the Mongol forces in the heart of Europe, produced a retreat that saved Western Christendom from the experience of conquest that had shattered every other civilization the Mongols had encountered. Whether Ogade's death was the decisive factor in that retreat, or whether the Mongols had already reached the limits of their logistical extension, is a question historians debate without resolution. The figure who emerges from all of this history, from the birth on the Lorne River to the unmarked grave in the Khenti Mountains, from the boy hiding in the river to the old man dictating final orders from his deathbed, is genuinely difficult. LT to contain within any simple moral or historical category. The scale of what he built and what he destroyed are both so vast as to resist easy evaluation. The 40 million dead are not a statistic, but a refusal to be comforted by complexity, a reminder that the political and cultural achievements of the Mongol period were built on a foundation of suffering so extensive that no accounting of its benefits can fully balance the ledger. And yet the benefits were real. The connections made, the knowledge transferred, the administrative innovations that outlasted the empire itself, the genetic legacy carried by millions of living people. These are also real. He remains the most consequential individual in the history of the Eurasian continent. By almost any measure that can be applied to such a claim, he is still studied by military historians, still invoked by political theorists, still revered in Mongolia, and still remembered with horror in Baghdad. The questions his life raises about the nature of power, the costs of empire, the relationship between destruction and creation, the ways in which individual will and historical circumstance interact, are not questions that history has answer, or that seem likely to be answered to anyone's full satisfaction. They are instead questions that the story of Genghis Khan keeps asking, generation after generation, to anyone who is willing to sit with their difficulty and their discomfort and resist the temptation to resolve them too quickly or too clearly, and lean into something simpler than they actually are. That discomfort, honestly faced, is perhaps the most valuable thing the story offers. Not a hero to admire or a villain to condemn, but a life of such extraordinary complexity and such extraordinary consequence, and engaging with it seriously requires us to think harder about what we mean when we use the words power, justice, legacy, and civilization than we might otherwise need to. And that kind of harder thinking, uncomfortable as it often is exactly what the best history asks of us. The bones of the great Khan lie somewhere beneath the soil of northeastern Mongolia, in a place the earth has kept secret for 8 centuries. The mountain above that place still carries its Mongolian name, Burkhan Khaldun, the same name it carried when a frightened young man hid in a river at its base and prayed to the sky to let him survive. He survived. He went on to change the world. The mountain kept his secret then, and it keeps his secret still. Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia in 1225, having accomplished something that would have seemed impossible to any observer alive at the time of his birth. He had unified the Mongol tribes into a single political entity for the first time in their history. He had broken through the Great Wall of China and occupied the entirety of northern China, reducing the Jin dynasty to a rump state clinging to its southern territories. He had destroyed the Khwarazmian Empire, the dominant power of Central Asia, in less than 2 years of campaigning, and depopulated or destroyed most of its great cities. He had sent his generals as far west as the Crimea and as far south as the Indus River, and they had beaten everything placed in front of them. He had built an administrative system, the Yasa, the postal relay network, the decimal military organization, the meritocratic appointment of commanders that was already demonstrating its capacity to govern territories of a scale no nomady sea power had ever managed to govern before. He was, by any objective measure, the most powerful person on earth. He was also in his early 60s, which by the hard standards of steppe life was genuinely old. The years of campaigning, the winter spent in the saddle, the accumulated injuries of a life in constant motion and frequent combat had taken their physical toll, but his mind was still fully engaged, still calculating, still planning, and there was unfinished business to attend to before he could rest in whatever way a man like Genghis Khan ever rested. The Western Xia Kingdom, the Tangut state that had been his first major target in 1209 and his original training ground for siege warfare, had during his long absence in Central Asia shown signs of independence that he found intolerable. They had refused to contribute troops to the Khwarazmian campaign when he demanded them, and their leading commander had reportedly responded to his demand with words of such dismissive arrogance, suggesting that if Genghis had too few eyes to fight Khwarazm, he had no claim to supreme power, that the slight was personal as well as political. In Mongol political culture, a vassal who refused the call of the great Khan was not simply an inconvenient subordinate to be managed diplomatically. They were a living demonstration that the system of loyalty that held the empire together could be defied. And if it could be defied once, publicly, without catastrophic consequences for the person who had defied it, then it could be defied everywhere, by everyone, and the entire structure that Genghis Khan had spent his life building would to dissolve. He began his final campaign in early 1226, leading his forces personally against the Western Shah with all the organized fury of an empire that had learned from decades of war how to apply overwhelming force precisely where it would be most decisive. The campaign moved with methodical relentlessness. The Mongols captured frontier cities in the Shah's western territories, drove southward through the Shah heartland, and caught the Shah army in the open on the frozen surface of the Yellow River, where the Mongol cavalry's advantage in mobility was maximized and the Shah forces, unable to use the terrain or their fortifications for protection, were destroyed. The Shah capital, Zhongxing, was placed under siege. It was here, during this final siege in the summer of 1227, that Genghis Khan died. He had been ill for months, the sources suggesting that a fall from his horse during a hunt in the previous winter had caused internal injuries that had never properly healed, leaving him weakened and increasingly debilitated through the campaign season. The exact cause of his final illness has never been definitively established by historians, and the surviving sources disagree in ways that cannot be fully reconciled. The most sober assessment of the evidence points to an illness that had been worsening through the months of the campaign, against which a man in his 60s with a body full of accumulated injuries and a lifetime of hard physical existence had no reserves left to draw on. Some sources mention something that sounds like typhus. Some mention complications from the horsefall. Some later accounts, almost certainly fictional and probably invented by enemies wishing to diminish the dignity of his memory, involve a Tangut princess with a concealed weapon. The secret history of the Mongols, the closest thing we have to an official Mongol account, does not detail the cause of death at all. He died on either the 18th or the 25th of August, 1227. The sources disagree on the specific date, which tells you something about the circumstances of the death. It was kept secret from essentially everyone outside a small inner circle. His last instructions, given from his deathbed, were that the siege of Zhongxing must continue and that the Western Shah must be utterly destroyed, that not a remnant of the civilization that had insulted him and defied him should remain to trouble his successors. His generals obeyed with the mechanical precision that the Yasa demanded. The city fell the month after his death, its population slaughtered, the Xia civilization extinguished as thoroughly as any the Mongols had encountered. He had kept his promise even after he was no longer alive to see it fulfilled. His body was returned to Mongolia in a secret funeral procession of the kind that has generated legends and speculation ever since. The Mongols had no tradition of elaborate burial monuments. Genghis Khan had reportedly expressed, at various times in his later life, a wish to be buried simply, without markings, without a tomb that could become a shrine or a target. The funeral party, by multiple accounts, killed everyone they encountered on the route back to Mongolia, ensuring that no one outside the immediate inner circle knew the path they traveled. At the burial site, believed to be near the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldan in the Kentiai Mountains of northeastern Mongolia, the actual place where Temujin had hidden in the river from the Taichiud, the place he had prayed after surviving that captivity, the place he had returned to across decades of conquest, to renew his relationship with the mountain and the sky god Tengri above it. Horses were ridden over the grave repeatedly to erase any trace of disturbed earth. Trees were planted. A special guard, called the Darkhad, was appointed to protect the area with their lives, sworn to eternal secrecy about what lay beneath their feet, and then the world moved on, or tried to. The location of Genghis Khan's tomb remains genuinely unknown today. Archaeological expeditions equipped with satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, drone surveys, and artificial intelligence analysis of landscape features have all been deployed in the Burkhan-Khaldan region, finding compelling circumstantial evidence in some locations but no definitive confirmation. The Mongolian government restricts access to the sacred area with a seriousness that reflects both genuine respect for Mongolian cultural tradition and the very real political stakes involved in the question of who controls the discovery of the great Khan's burial place. The mystery endures, and the endurance of the mystery is itself a kind of monument. The most powerful man of his age lies in an unmarked grave in a land that still honors him as a founding father, and the place of his rest belongs to the Aetsia and the sky that he worshipped, not to human curiosity. The empire he built did not die with him. It entered, if anything, its most territorially expansive phase in the decades following his death. His designated successor, his third son Ogedei, was confirmed as Great Khan at a Kurultai in 1229 and immediately resumed the campaigns that his father had set in motion. The Jin dynasty, which had survived Genghis Khan's campaigns in a severely weakened but still technically existing state, was finally destroyed in 1234, its last emperor committing suicide as Mongol and allied Song Chinese forces broke through the walls of his final refuge. Korea was reduced to tributary status. The Russian principalities of Kiam Rus, which Subutai had scouted during his Great Western Reconnaissance of 1221 to 1223, were invaded in the winter of 1237 and 1238 in a campaign of devastating speed and thoroughness. Vladimir, Ryazan, Suzdal, Kiev, city after city fell. A Rus chronicler, writing of the destruction of Kiev in 1240, described the former capital of the Rus world as a landscape of bones and silence. The Mongols crossed into Poland and Hungary in 1241. Defeating Poland, they turned back because the Mongol political system required that the senior princes return to Mongolia to participate in the Kurultai that would select a new Great Khan. Western Europe was within operational reach. Whether it would have been conquered in subsequent campaigns is one of history's most enduring counterfactual questions, and historians have been disagreeing about the answer for centuries. What is clear is that the kingdoms of Western Europe had no effective intelligence about what the Mongols were, how they fought, or what had happened to the vastly more powerful kingdoms to the east in the preceding decades. The Hungarian king Bela IV, having received warnings from Cuman refugees who had fled the Mongol advance, was unable to convince his fellow European rulers that the threat was real until the army that confirmed it was already inside his borders. The assumption that distance and the campaign against the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, conducted by Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu, represents in the memory of the Islamic world what the Mongol period primarily means: a catastrophe so devastating that it ended an era and left wounds that took centuries to heal. Baghdad in the mid-13th century was, by any measure, one of the great cities of the world. It had been the center of the Abbasid Caliphate for 500 years. Its population may have been as high as 800,000 people, though estimates vary. It was the seat of the House of Wisdom, the library and intellectual center that had for centuries served as the primary repository and expansion point for Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arab learning. Scholars there had translated and preserved Greek philosophical and scientific works that would otherwise have been lost. had developed the mathematical foundations of algebra, had made advances in astronomy, medicine, and Hulagu's forces besieged Baghdad in January of 1258 with a force that included not only Mongol cavalry, but Persian, Armenian, and Georgian troops, along with Chinese engineers operating the siege artillery. The Caliph al-Musta'idin, the last of the Abbasid line to rule in Baghdad, refused to negotiate seriously despite multiple opportunities to do so. Whether this reflected religious conviction that God would not allow the center of the Islamic world to fall, political miscalculation about Hulagu's actual intentions, or simply the paralysis that sometimes grips leaders who find themselves facing situations their entire prior experience has not prepared them for, is impossible to determine from this. The siege was brief. The walls were breached within days, and for approximately 2 weeks, Baghdad was given over to a systematic sacking. The numbers of dead in the sources range from 200,000 to 1 million, and while both extremes are probably unreliable as specific figures, the demographic catastrophe was real and lasting. Mesopotamia never regained the population density or agricultural productivity it had achieved before the Mongols. The Caliph al-Musta'idin was executed in the traditional Mongol method reserved for those of royal blood, wrapped in felt so that his blood would not touch the sacred ground and then ridden over by horses. His death ended the Abbasid Caliphate, the destruction of the House of Wisdom and its library was perhaps the most culturally significant single act of the entire Mongol period. The manuscripts that had been gathered there represented an irreplaceable concentration of human knowledge, and the specific nature of what was in them, the translations, the commentaries, the original works, made them something that could not be replaced by starting over. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, writing in the Mongol service half a century later, described the waters of the Tigris running black from the ink of the books that had been thrown in, and red from the blood of the scholars who had been killed. The image, whether literally accurate or rhetorically heightened, captures something true about what was lost. A convergence of the fall of Baghdad in 1258 is generally cited by historians as the moment that definitively ended the Islamic Golden Age. The scholarly networks, the patronage relationships, the physical infrastructure of libraries and observatories and schools, the communities of scholars who had sustained several centuries of scientific and intellectual achievement were shattered in ways from which they never fully recovered. Knowledge that had been preserved and extended over centuries disappeared permanently. The cultural trauma was so profound that it has shaped how the Islamic world remembers the Mongol period ever since, as a civilizational catastrophe rather than as a... And yet, the same empire that produced Baghdad 1258 also produced the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, and the trade and cultural exchange that characterized the period of Mongol dominance over the Eurasian landmass, from roughly the 1240s to the 134s, CEOs. The Silk Road, which had always been more of a network of overlapping regional routes than a single unified highway, fell for the first time in history under a single administrative authority, a merchant with a Mongol passport. The golden tablet Paisi that guaranteed protection and assistance at relay stations throughout the empire could travel from Constantinople to Beijing and face no bandits operating with impunity, no local lords imposing arbitrary tolls, no provincial wars disrupting the route. The system worked because the Mongols enforced it with exactly the consistency and ruthlessness that Marco Polo's journey from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan in China, which he undertook beginning in 1271 and which produced the most influential European account of East Asia before the Age of Exploration, was made possible by this system. He and his father and uncle traveled under Mongol protection, and the account they brought back of the wealth and sophistication of the Yuan dynasty's China fundamentally expanded European understanding of what lay to the east, contributing to the curiosity and ambition that would eventually produce the Age of Exploration. Columbus, sailing west in 1492, was partly motivated by the desire to find a sea route to the fabulously wealthy China that Marco Polo. The goods that moved along the Mongol-protected Silk Road were transformative in their effects. From China came silk, porcelain, tea, and paper. From the Islamic world came medical texts, astronomical knowledge, and mathematical advances. From India came spices and precious stones. From Europe came silver, wool, and horses. But more consequential than any specific commodity was the movement of ideas and technologies that accompanied the goods. Gunpowder, which Chinese military engineers had been refining for decades before the Mongol conquests, made its way to the Islamic world and then to Europe through the Mongol period, eventually transforming warfare so completely that the entire medieval system of stone fortification and armored cavalry became obsolete. The compass reached Europe from China during this period. Paper-making techniques spread west. The printing technologies that would eventually make possible the irony that the very efficiency of the Mongol trade network also facilitated the spread of the Black Death, which originated in Central Asia in the 1340s and traveled the Silk Road to reach Europe, where it killed between a third and a half of the continent's population, is one of history's darker paradoxes. The same roads that carried silk and spices and the compass also carried the bacterium that caused one of the worst demographic catastrophes in human history. The Pax Mongolica, in this sense, was exactly what it claimed to be, and something much more complicated than its name suggests. It was a peace maintained by the credible threat of total annihilation, a stability built on foundations of mass death. The empire began to fragment in the years after Ogeday's death in 1241, a process that accelerated through the subsequent decades as the grandsons of Genghis Khan competed for supremacy, and the sheer distances of the empire made unified administration increasingly difficult to maintain. By the 1260s, the empire had effectively divided into 4 separate successor states. The Yuan dynasty in China, founded by Kublai Khan. The Ilkhanate in Persia and Mesopotamia, ruled by Hulagu and his descendants. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde, which controlled the Pontic and Caspian steppes and exercised the demanding overlordship over the Russian principalities that would last for more than 2 centuries. These khanates were sometimes allied, sometimes at war with each other, and each developed its own character as the Mongol rulers absorbed elements of the cultures they had conquered, converting in many cases to the dominant religions of those subject populations. The Ilkhanate rulers became Muslims. The Yuan dynasty adopted Chinese cultural form. Kublai Khan's Yuan dynasty in China represents perhaps the most remarkable of these successor states from the perspective of governance and cultural achievement. Kublai was both a Mongol great Khan and a Chinese emperor in the full traditional sense, ruling a population of tens of millions through an administrative system that blended Mongol organizational principles with Chinese bureaucratic tradition in ways that were often creative and sometimes dysfunctional. He completed the conquest of the Song dynasty in the south in 1279, becoming the first ruler in history to govern all of China as a unified entity, and he presided over one of the most cosmopolitan courts the world had ever seen. Marco Polo could sit at the imperial table in the Yuan capital Khanbalik, which was built on the site of modern Beijing, alongside Persian scholars, Tibetan Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christian administrators, Muslim merchants from Central Asia, and Confucian literati, all participating in a court culture that drew freely from every civilization it encountered. The Yuan dynasty lasted until 1368, when the Ming dynasty expelled the Mongols and reunified. The question of what Genghis Khan ultimately left behind is both the most important question his story raises and the hardest to answer cleanly, because the answer depends so entirely on where you are standing. He was responsible, directly and through the campaigns of his successors that he set in motion, for the deaths of somewhere between 30 and 40 million people in an era when the global population was perhaps 400 million. In the regions most severely affected by the Mongol campaigns, the population may have declined by 30% or more, a demographic collapse of a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. Cities that had been home to hundreds of thousands of people for centuries were emptied. Agricultural systems that had fed those cities were destroyed. Libraries containing irreplaceable accumulations of human knowledge were burned or thrown into rivers. And yet, he promoted based on merit in a world entirely organized around the hereditary privileges of birth. He protected religious freedom across his empire at a time when the alternative, religious persecution, was the default policy of every major civilization on Earth. He created a legal framework that applied to all subjects equally, including in principle himself. He established the world's first truly international postal system and the first secure trade routes across the full length of the Eurasian landmass. He created the conditions for the first direct contact between Europe and China, contact that eventually contributed to the intellectual revolution of the Renaissance and the geographical revolution of the Age of Exploration. He valued and rewarded loyalty with a consistency that made his organization. He never had his portrait painted during his lifetime, or if he did, none survive. He left no grand monuments, no pyramids, no temples dedicated to himself. He asked to be buried without markings, without a tomb that could become a symbol. The physical evidence of his life on Earth is almost nothing. He is present instead in the genetic record of the populations whose ancestors his armies passed through, in the administrative systems that his successors adapted and extended, in the trade routes that he secured, in the cultural exchanges his empire facilitated, in the stories. The genetic legacy is perhaps the most literally embodied aspect of what he left behind, and it is one of the more remarkable findings in the history of population genetics. In 2003, a landmark study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics identified a distinctive Y chromosome lineage present in approximately 8% of men across a vast region of Asia stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. The lineage appeared to have originated in Mongolia roughly 1,000 years ago, consistent with the lifetime of Genghis Khan, and it was present at unusually high frequency among populations historically documented as descended from Genghis Khan and his close male relatives, the Hazaras of Pakistan and Afghanistan, who maintain a strong oral tradition of descent from the Mongol conquerors, showed the lineage at rates approaching 30%. If the sample in that study was representative of the broader population, which the authors explicitly acknowledged, subsequent research has both questioned some specific aspects of the original study's methodology and confirmed the broader finding, the conclusion that Genghis Khan and his close male relatives spread their genetic contribution to an extraordinary degree is essentially unchallenged. The mechanism is not difficult to understand. He and his sons and grandsons ruled an empire of 100 million people for generations, maintained large harems as was standard for rulers of their status, and the cultural norms of the time ensured that their reproductive output was systematically larger than that of ordinary men. Jochi, his eldest son, reportedly had 40 sons of his own. If those sons each had 20 and their sons each had 10, the arithmetic of exponential growth in genetic contribution becomes staggering very quickly. The result, 800 years later, is that something like 1 in every 200 men alive today carries a Y chromosome that traces in Mongolia today. Genghis Khan is not primarily a historical figure in the way that, say, Julius Caesar is a historical figure in Europe, something studied in schools and respected as history but not personally significant. He is the founding father of the nation, the creator of the Mongolian identity, the man who gave his people a unified political existence, a written language, a legal code, and a place in world history of such magnitude that even the small and most remote Mongolian school knows about it. His image appears on the currency, on the national airline, on the international airport in the capital Ulaanbaatar, on vodka labels and beer cans and souvenir shops. The remarkable equestrian statue near the Tool River, 40 meters tall and visible for miles across the open steppe, stands as a monument to a pride in the Mongol legacy that communist-era restrictions tried to suppress, and that has reasserted itself with remarkable force since Mongolian independence in 1990. Mongolians speak of Genghis Khan with a reverence that in much of the Islamic world, his memory reads very differently. The destruction of Baghdad, of the great cities of Central Asia, of the Abbasid Caliphate and its irreplaceable cultural heritage, is remembered as a civilizational wound from which the Islamic world has never fully healed. The Islamic Golden Age, the period of extraordinary scientific and intellectual achievement that had made the Islamic world the leading civilization on earth for centuries, ended in the Mongol period, and the causal connection between the Mongol destruction of the institutional and physical infrastructure of Islamic scholarship, and that ending is too direct to be explained away. When people in the Middle East remember the Mongols, they remember the burning of Baghdad, the pyramids of skulls, the destruction of things that took centuries to build and that were never rebuilt, the complexity of the Mongol legacy, its production in Russia, the Mongol period, remembered as the Mongol yoke, has shaped national identity and national historical understanding in ways that historians still actively debate. The 2 centuries of Golden Horde overlordship over the Russian principalities, the requirement to pay tribute, to send young men for Mongol military service, to receive and acknowledge Mongol patents of authority for Russian princes who were intended to rule, left traces in Russian administrative culture, in the Russian word for treasury, in elements of Russian governance that some historians trace to Mongol influence and that others see as Russian developments responding to Mongol demands. Whether the Mongol period explains Russia's different developmental trajectory from Western Europe, or whether it is one factor among many, or whether the similarities that some see between Mongol and later Russian imperial governance reflect. His military methods have been studied in professional military contexts for as long as there have been professional military institutions to study them. The combination of extreme mobility and firepower that characterized Mongol cavalry tactics, the use of psychological warfare and terror as force multipliers, the systematic gathering of intelligence before operations, the flexible, combined arms approach that integrated cavalry, siege artillery, and engineering capabilities, the meritocratic command structure that elevated talent wherever it could be found. All of these elements appear in discussions of military innovation across centuries and cultures, elements of what Genghis Khan developed on the Mongolian steppe in the 12th and 13th centuries appear in analyses of Sherman's campaigns in the American Civil War, in discussions of German blitzkrieg doctrine in the Second World War, in modern military theory about information warfare and the weaponization of uncertainty and fear. He was not primitive. He was in his domain perhaps the most sophisticated practitioner of organized violence who has ever lived. The question of what to do with Genghis Khan, intellectually and morally and historically, is ultimately the question of what to do with history itself, with the fact that the past was made by people operating under different assumptions, different constraints, and fundamentally different moral frameworks than we bring to evaluating them. He did not think of himself as a monster, and many of the people who followed him voluntarily, who swore loyalty to him and fought under his banner and died for him, clearly did not think of him as one either. He thought of himself as chosen by Tengri, by the eternal blue sky that arched over the steppe he had grown up on, to unite the peoples under heaven and to make them one. He pursued that mandate with a consistency and a ferocity that is consistent with genuine conviction rather than mere rhetoric or cynical calculation. The peoples he destroyed would have disagreed, and their disagreement would have been legitimate, and their suffering was real. What the story of Genghis Khan ultimately tells us is something about the nature of historical transformation itself, that the things which most fundamentally change the world are rarely simple in their effects, that creation and destructio are not always opposites, but are sometimes expressions of the same force, that the connections between civilizations that we now take for granted were in many cases created through processes of violence and suffering that we would find completely unacceptable, that the genetic material of perhaps 16 million living people traces back to a man who was also responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of others, and that all of this is simultaneously true and must be held in mind simultaneously if we are going to understand the world. He was born clutching a blood clot in his fist on the banks of the Unon River, in a felt tent, in one of the hardest landscapes on earth. He was abandoned by his clan as a child and left to starve. He was enslaved and humiliated and escaped. He built from nothing, one person at a time, by the force of his intelligence and his will and his extraordinary understanding of other people's motivations, the largest empire in the history of the world. He killed more people than almost anyone who has ever lived. He also connected more of the world than almost anyone who had lived before him. He is buried in an unmarked grave, whose location remains one of history's enduring mysteries, in a land that still honors him as a father, near a sacred mountain where he once prayed in fear for his life as a young man. 800 years after his death, his presence is still felt in the genes of millions of people, in the trade routes his army secured, in the administrative innovations his successors extended, and in the questions his life and his leg. The steppe grass is still there, moving in the wind. The Own River still flows through the country of his birth. The mountain Berkan Kaudan still stands, still sacred, still protected. Somewhere beneath its slopes, the secret it has kept for 8 centuries still intact. And tonight, in the quiet of wherever you are listening, that story is still alive, still moving through the air, the way all the most important stories do. As long as there are people who want to tell them, and people who want to hear them, the rivers he crossed still run. The grass of the Mongolian plateau still moves in the same wind that swept across it when mounted archers rode through it 8 centuries ago. The routes that his merchants and diplomats and postal riders traveled across the length of Asia are still there, overlaid now with asphalt and rail lines, but following in many cases the same corridors between mountains and deserts that Mongol horses found first. History does not stay in the past. It persists in the shapes of things, in the distributions of people and genes and languages, in the borders that were drawn and redrawn in the aftermath of empires, in the cultural memories that communities carry forward through centuries. Wargrid, whether they want to or not, the Mongol Empire ended, as all empires do. But the world it made, the connections it forged, the destructions it inflicted, and the possibilities it opened, these things did not end with it. They became part of the ongoing story of the human world, present in ways both visible and invisible to everyone who lives. If tonight's story resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Whispered Empires. Your support makes it possible to keep bringing these stories to life with the depth and care they deserve. Until next time.